Hey everyone, this is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the VO2 Max podcast. You'll notice that this is the first podcast I've put out in a few months. I took most of the time around the new year and the holidays, and actually all of January off from putting together podcast content. I was focused a little bit more on some other projects that I have going on, but I figured starting in February, I'll get back on track with putting out some podcast content. So this is hopefully the first one that I'll put out in February. Right now it's set to come out February 1st, and this episode is going to be talking all about music and its effects on performance. Now, within the realm of music, there's a couple different categories, if you will, of listening to music and its effects on performance. The first one that I'll talk about, and the first area I'll kind of touch on really briefly, is listening to music during exercise or during a training session or even during a race. And then the second area is listening to music before exercise and then not listening to it during exercise. So the reason I wanted to talk about both of those different areas or realms within the overall scope of listening to music and its effects on performance is because a lot of athletes will listen to music during training sessions and even some athletes during races if your race allows it. But for a lot of endurance athletes, particularly triathletes, where triathlon prohibits music across any of the disciplines, and a lot of other endurance sports and races prohibit music as well during their racing. Some athletes can't listen to music while they're actually performing on race day. But is there also a benefit to listening to music before a race in a scenario where an athlete might not necessarily be able to listen to music while they're actually performing and racing? So like I said, the first area that I'm going to talk about is listening to music during exercise. Or for most athletes, this will be during training, and then for some athletes, it could be during races as well. Like, for example, I know I'm huge on listening to music during training just because I think it helps me kind of like zone out and get, really into the training session itself. And so I'll normally listen to music on almost all of my sessions except for swimming. I refuse to listen to music during swimming just because swimming is so technique and focus driven that I don't really want to zone out. But for, cycling and running, for the most part, most sessions, you're just trying to get into the performance of the session. And you're not necessarily acutely focused on like a technical aspect of cycling or running. And so, for training sessions like that, where you're not hyper focused on technique, listening to music isn't necessarily a bad thing, because at least I personally find that it helps me kind of zone out and get focused on the session. But is there actually a benefit of listening to music during training on performance, or even during racing as well? So like I've raced with music in some running races. And it turns out that there is. So research tends to show that it does overall lead to improved performance, so better performance. Take that as you will, across a variety of different endurance sports, along with a decrease in rating of perceived exertion, increases in or increased feelings of energy and stimulation as well. So this is obviously all a good thing, right? You're getting lower rating of perceived exertion along with greater feelings of kind of energy and overall stimulation, and then stemming from all this tends to be a slight improvement in performance. So listening to music during training isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as it's, as long as you're not compromising safety in any way. So I know some people will particularly avoid listening to music like when they're going out and riding their bike outdoors, or if they're going trail running where they might want to be more aware of noises around them. So I know some people will avoid it for that reason. But for the most part, if you're listening to music during a training session, it's usually going to be a good thing, especially if it's music that you prefer. So it has to be music that the athlete prefers and that they find motivational, and that's like somewhat upbeat to a certain extent. And in general, that music is likely going to enhance your overall performance in training. And then same thing if you listen to music as well while you're racing. So, some running races, for example, let you listen to music. They don't necessarily prohibit it. And so listening to music might not be a bad thing, especially if you're used to it in training as well and you really enjoy it. Then doing it on race day, it's only going to help you on race day as well, just like it would in your training. So in general, it does seem that there's a pretty straightforward consensus that listening to music during training does tend to improve performance. Now, again, the reasons that you might not listen to music during training or racing would obviously be for safety reasons for the most part. And then some people just don't like to listen to music. So, if you're not necessarily listening to it for safety reasons, I know of some athletes that just prefer not to listen to music. They like to zone out a totally different way than listening to music. They like to just hear the sounds around them or go out in nature and hear the sounds of nature. And all that's valid too. So it's not like listening to music, it's not like you have to listen to music during a training session or during a race to maximize your performance. The research tends to show that listening to music can have a benefit, potentially an additional benefit on your performance. So it's not a bad thing to try out or consider if you've never listened to music while you're exercising or while you're training and racing. But if it's not for you, then it's not for you. But this moves me on to the next category or area within the overall scope of music and performance, which is listening to music before exercise or before a training session or before a race. And this particular area within the scope of music and performance becomes a lot more relevant for most endurance athletes because even though they might be able to listen to it during a training session, a lot of endurance athletes can't necessarily listen to music when they're racing, particularly, cycling races, mountain bike racing, triathlons. I know a lot of triathlons will strictly prohibit it, especially certain race organizations. So for the most part, music is prohibited in racing, again, with a few caveats, and there are some races and types of races where music is allowed. But for the most part, most people will listen to music just during training, with a few of them during racing. But, we've all probably seen when we're at a race venue before the race has started, we'll see most of the athletes or a lot of the athletes who are participating in that race, with their headphones in and listening to music and going through their warm-up routine and whatever it is that their whole pre-race routine is. Now, is there a benefit to that as well? Is there a benefit to listening to music before you go out and try and perform? And it turns out that there is as well. And I wanted to highlight one particular recent study that I came across that demonstrates the benefits of listening to music before exercise quite nicely. And the research as well outside of this one study tends to show similar findings in the sense that listening to music before exercise, just like listening to it during exercise, tends to have a beneficial effect on performance as long as that music is preferred. In other words, the athlete enjoys that style, that type of music, that particular song, and it's relatively upbeat. So a super slow, sad song, might not necessarily be the best choice of music, either during exercise or before exercise, but rather something that maybe has a slightly faster beat, something that's a little bit more motivational, and then something that the athlete just prefers to listen to and they really enjoy to listen to and they find motivational. So, listening to music before exercise. There was one particular study that I wanted to highlight that was done recently. I think it was either in 2020 or 2019 by a few researchers. And what they did was they had research participants perform a 2,000 meter time trial performance on a rowing ergometer. So think of like an indoor rowing ergometer. So they would perform a 2,000 meter time trial, and they had 3 different groups that they enrolled participants into. One group listened to no music, so they did their 2,000 meter time trial performance with no music. The second group listened to music, but it wasn't music that they preferred, so it was a researcher selected style of music that participant didn't necessarily prefer or enjoy or find motivational, so it was just kind of like generic music. And then they had a third group where the research subjects got to pick out the song that they listened to. So they were obviously going to pick out a song that they prefer and that they find motivational. Okay, so that's important. So you have those 3 different groups. So they didn't necessarily just have 2 groups, one that was music versus no music. So they wanted to try and isolate another variable outside of the music itself, which was the preferred type of music that the research subjects selected. So rather than just comparing a music group versus a non-music group, they had that third group in there, which was generic non-preferred music, and then another music group, which was preferred music. So that way they could see not only if music had a benefit when listened to before the 2,000 meter time trial performance, but they could also see if there was an additional benefit of a preferred type of music on the subsequent performance. Okay, so that 3-group design is really important because it isolates a few different variables: the music, but also the style, type, and preferred nature of the music that an athlete selects before they go out and try and perform. Okay, so basically what they did was each group, the control group obviously that didn't get music, they just did nothing. They sat around and they didn't do anything before their performance. The non-preferred music group listened to that music before their 2,000 meter time trial performance. And then the preferred music group did the same thing. They listened to that music before their performance. But once all of them got to the 2,000 meter time trial on the rowing ergometer, there was no music whatsoever. So this study was just looking at the effects of music before exercise on subsequent performance. And basically what they found was that the preferred music group had a higher heart rate response and greater motivation when compared to the other 2 groups, so the non-preferred music and no music at all. And they had better performance. So basically what this study showed was that preferred music really, really matters. So listening to just any old music whatsoever doesn't necessarily have a benefit. It has to be unique to the athlete and what they like. So, for example, if you go to a race venue, a lot of race venues will just have loudspeakers and just, kind of random music playing in the background. I've been to a lot of race venues, and a lot of that music isn't necessarily music that I would listen to. So when I go and I do my warm-up, I'll normally put in my headphones and listen to usually some very specific songs that I find motivational, and they kind of help get me focused and in a zone. Now that aspect of music is extremely important, because it seems that the music needs to be preferred and liked by the athlete who's listening to it, or else there isn't necessarily a performance-enhancing response from the music, whether it's listened to during training or before training or racing, right? So if you're listening to music while you're training and racing, again, it has to be preferred and liked, and you need to find it motivational. But the same thing is true if you're listening to music before you go and train or race. It needs to be something that you really enjoy and that you find motivational, because the research tends to show us that if you were to just listen to generic music that you don't necessarily identify with or like, then it's basically the equivalent of listening to no music at all. And again, it's not necessarily, this research doesn't necessarily say that listening to no music is harmful on performance, because obviously a lot of people do very well and they race very well without listening to music. And so you don't have to listen to music. But what a lot of this research shows us is that listening to music can have a potential improvement or lead to a potential improvement on performance. But again, every athlete is different. And so some athletes might not necessarily see an improvement if that's just the way that they're hardwired, or that's the way that that they've gone about their training and racing, is they're used to doing it without listening to music. But it's worth a try if you've never tried it. And for the athletes that do already do it and listen to music before racing or during training and racing, then just know that there are some potential benefits of doing that, and you're likely seeing that in your performance, whether it's during a training session or whether it's in a race. But again, make sure that music is somewhat upbeat and it's motivational and it's something that you like and enjoy. Because that seems to be a really important factor when it comes to the overall larger scope of listening to music and its benefits on performance. So hopefully this podcast was useful for you as an endurance athlete or as a coach if you're listening to this as well. This was a relatively short podcast because this research tends to be relatively straightforward for the most part. There's not really a whole lot of back and forth or debate or questions within the research literature about this. In general, it seems that listening to music can have some benefits on performance, whether it's during training or during racing. But for those athletes who can't necessarily listen to music during a race, there is some benefit to be had by listening to music before that race. Again, I've said it a lot, just as long as that music is something that the athlete really enjoys and prefers. And I've said that a lot because that piece is really important. Listening to any old music isn't going to do you any good. Make sure that it's music that you enjoy and that you find motivational. And so what I would recommend you do if you're someone who does listen to music a lot when you're training and racing, or if you're trying to get into it a little bit more, the best place to experiment with it is during training. So find songs that you like when you're out training, and create create a playlist. So if you listen to Spotify, create a Spotify playlist. If it's on, Apple Music, make an Apple Music playlist. Whatever your mode or method of listening to music is, just create a specific training or racing playlist. And then that way you don't necessarily have to go searching and sifting through songs on race day or when you're going into a training session. You can just have a very specific playlist that you go to that has songs that that are motivational, that you enjoy, and that are gonna help augment or enhance your performance to some degree. So that would be my recommendation for you if you are already listening to music, or if you're trying to get into listening to music a little bit more while you're training or before you're racing. So again, I hope you found this podcast useful and informative as I talked a little bit about the research surrounding music and its effects on performance. As always, if you have any questions on this topic or any of the other topics in our other podcasts, you can always feel free to reach out to me at peakenduranceSolutions@outlook.com. Also, our website, you can contact me through there at www.peakenduranceSolutions.com. And as always, I'll be sure to link references and those modes of contacts into the show notes below. Thanks, and looking forward to you joining us again next time. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you liked what you heard in today's episode, please feel free to leave us a review. Those reviews are greatly appreciated and help spread the word about our podcast, as well as help us improve the content that we deliver to our listeners. And then finally, if you know of anyone who would be interested in listening to our podcast, please go ahead and share our podcast with them.